What's up, guys? Welcome back to the channel. Here we are with another reaction. In this, we have Americans are wrong about World War II. Here's why. Before we dive in and figure out the answer to that question, if you guys happen to enjoy, please don't forget to subscribe, get a video a thumbs up. Also, if you guys support the channel by becoming a member, all you gotta do is hit that join button to receive your exclusive benefits. Let's dive right in.
In American culture, World War II occupies a near sacred space. It's remembered as a noble crusade in which the United States emerged as the heroic liberator of Europe and the Pacific. This narrative is comforting to millions of Americans.
I feel like, yeah, that is definitely the American narrative that we were taught, that the good old US of A came in and saved the day. And then after watching many videos about this topic, you come to learn that the USA came in at the tail end of the war. The war was almost won at that point. The America helped, yes, America did help, but the heavy lifting, told from other countries' point of view, was already done when the USA came in. And so it's just interesting that we're taught this perspective, but all these other countries have this view of it, and it's like, hey, was we being lied to, trying to turn us into the heroes again? America actually got pretty rich off that war. They got rich off World War II.
But I've done my research and it's wrong. While the United States undeniably played a major role in the Allied victory, its self-image as the decisive and virtuous force in World War II is a distortion that ignores critical realities.
Yeah.
From underestimating the Soviet Union's central role to misrepresenting the use of the atomic bomb, America's memory of World War II is less about historical accuracy and more about national myth-making. In this video, we're debunking some of the myths of the American World War II narrative to explain what really happened. Now, perhaps one of the most glaring omissions to Americans is the scale of the Soviet Union's contribution and sacrifice in defeating Nazi Germany.
Yeah,
in fact,
Hitler made a mistake going after the Soviets. It was a lot of Soviets who passed, but Nazi Germany wasn't effing with them, right? They wasn't finna defeat the Soviets. The Soviets was
many Americans likely wouldn't even know that the Soviet Union played such a major role. However, much of the war was fought along what is known as the Eastern Front. And one of the most important battles of the war was the Battle of Stalingrad, which allowed for the encirclement and destruction of the Germany's Sixth Army and let the Soviets move towards Berlin on behalf of the Allies. By the war's end, around 80% of all German military deaths occurred on the Eastern Front, and the Soviet Union lost over 27 million people, including civilians.
It's often the Soviets definitely lost a lot of people in that fight, but Germany still wasn't going to defeat them. So yeah, even though I don't rock with the Soviets, because then they put Poland and half of Germany behind the Iron Curtain and made them submit to communism. You feel me? The Soviets did play a big part in World War II victory, for sure.
Said that World War II was won with British intelligence, American steel, and Russian blood. But despite these staggering figures when it comes to the Soviets, American cultural memory really erases Soviet involvement.
Agreed.
In part, this can be traced to Cold War propaganda, which sought to minimize Soviet accomplishments and cast the USSR as an adversary, not a wartime ally. Even today, American school textbooks and war films really rarely acknowledge the extent to which the Soviet Union helped win the war for the Allies. Number 2,
facts.
America was not the reluctant savior. A foundational part of the American myth is the idea that the US was reluctantly dragged into the war by the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in December of 1941. President Franklin D. Roosevelt called it a date which will live in infamy, and the narrative of sudden, unprovoked aggression has been used to frame the US role as one of reactive justice rather than proactive ambition. In truth, America was already involved in the war long before Pearl Harbor, economically, diplomatically, and ideologically. Through the Lend-Lease Act of 1941, the United States provided over $50 billion, equivalent to around $750 billion today, in war supplies to the United Kingdom, the Soviet Union, China, and other allies.
That much? Jeez Louise, my
Roosevelt had long been preparing the country for war,
Yeah.
even while publicly maintaining a stance of neutrality in order to navigate Congress and public opinion. Moreover, American sanctions and embargoes against Japan, particularly on oil, were deliberately designed to deter Japanese expansion in Asia. Historian Charles Beard, a prominent critic of Roosevelt's foreign policy, argued that the administration knowingly pursued policies that would force Japan's hand. While such claims remain controversial, they underscore this other idea that perhaps Pearl Harbor was the climax of escalating tensions between the US and Japan that the US had helped cultivate. The image of America as
Dang. I feel like the way it was taught was that like Japan wasn't provoked into attacking us. They just did because they were on the other side, right? They were on the other side, and so they came and attacked the USA. But I ain't know that we could have actually forced our hand and provoked them into doing that to where they had no other option. Wow.
a reluctant participant erases the strategic calculations and growing global ambitions that motivated intervention. The war offered an opportunity to America to assert American influence and established a post-war order aligned with U.S. economic and political interests.
Yep.
Next up on my list has to do with the atomic bombs. American textbooks often assert that the atomic bombings of Nagasaki and Hiroshima were necessary to end the war and save lives, typically citing the estimated 500,000 American casualties that might have resulted from a land invasion of Japan. However, many senior military leaders at the time questioned the necessity of using nuclear weapons. General Dwight D. Eisenhower later wrote, "I voiced to him, speaking to the Secretary of War, my grave misgivings, first on the basis of my belief that Japan was already defeated and that dropping the bomb was completely unnecessary." Similarly, another admiral stated, "The use of this weapon was of no material assistance in our war against Japan." Japan had already...
I feel like it wasn't necessarily about if Japan was defeated. I feel like that was more so of the United States maybe trying to send a message to the world that we had these bombs and we're not afraid to use them if attacked. We will. I feel like that's probably the message the USA was trying to send. If they knew that Japan was defeated and decided to drop the bombs anyway, of course, that's a lot of lives. That's a lot of lives that were taken that didn't have to be taken. But yeah, I feel like if that's the logic, then the U.S. was probably like it was probably these bombs were probably more to send a message to the rest of the world.
been devastated by conventional firebombing campaigns, the destruction of infrastructure, and a tightening naval blockade. In July of 1945, the U.S. intercepted messages indicating that Japanese leaders were seeking terms for surrender, primarily the preservation of the emperor. In early August, the Soviet Union declared war on Japan and launched a massive invasion, delivering a psychological and strategic blow that many historians consider the final push towards surrender. So, why use the bombs? Increasingly, scholars argue that the atomic bombs were at least partially intended to send a message to the Soviet Union. The US wanted to end the war swiftly and decisively, not just to save lives, but to control the post-war geopolitical landscape without Soviet interference in Japan. One historian wrote in his book, The Decision to Use the...
I said to the rest of I still think to the rest of the world, but Soviets might have been the main recipient of the message, but it was a message to the world.
Atomic bomb that the bomb's use was the first act of the Cold War. Now let's talk about the myth of the American military as the decisive force. Hollywood, television, and national commemoration have helped create the impression in America that American soldiers were the principal liberators of Europe and the Pacific. While American troops absolutely did fight bravely and effectively across the war front, the reality is that victory came through an enormous and often messy coalition effort. American military supremacy was neither automatic nor singularly decisive. The British Empire played a central role in resisting Axis aggression long before the United States entered the war.
For sure.
After the fall of France in 1940, Britain stood alone in Europe against Nazi Germany for more than a year, enduring relentless bombing during the Battle of Britain, the first significant defeat for Hitler's military.
Yep.
British pilots fought off the Germans in a campaign that Winston Churchill would later praise and say, "Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Britain also led numerous campaigns in North Africa, the Mediterranean, and Southeast Asia. The British Eighth Army, under commanders like Montgomery, played a decisive role in the defeat of German and Italian forces in North Africa, particularly around 1942. This was what Churchill called the end of the beginning. Meanwhile, British and Commonwealth forces fought grueling jungle campaigns against the Japanese in Burma, often under harsh conditions and with little recognition in the American-dominated narrative. In Europe, the Royal Navy kept vital Atlantic supply lines open, while British intelligence services, including the codebreakers at Bletchley Park, made significant contributions to the Allied war effort, most famously by cracking the German Enigma code. And even after American forces arrived in large numbers, the war remained a joint effort. The D-Day invasion itself was a British-led operation, the overall commander of naval forces was a British admiral, and 2 of the 5 landing beaches, Gold and Sword, were taken by British forces. Canada took a third. British and Commonwealth troops continued fighting side by side with Americans throughout the campaigns across Europe. But by focusing exclusively on American heroism, popular culture in the States erases the efforts of Britain and its vast imperial forces, millions of soldiers from India, Africa, Australia, New Zealand, Canada, and the Caribbean, all of whom played indispensable roles in the Allied victory. Historian James Holland notes in The War in the West that the war in Europe and North Africa would have been completely unwinnable without British leadership and persistence, particularly in the early years when America was not yet engaged.
That's what we're saying. There was a lot of heavy lifting done before the U.S. came in towards the end of the war. Like she said, U.S. did help. Those soldiers did fight bravely, but they weren't the main reason for the Allies defeating Hitler and winning the war. The Britain definitely did a ton during that war, as you saw the Soviets as well. So yeah, I mean, like she said, it was taught to us the way it was taught to us that America was the hero of World War II, right? And the decisive factor. But when you kind of learn history being taught outside of America, you learn that no, we weren't, and that we were lied to, and that a lot of the times we've decided to rewrite history and make us the hero.
Even U.S. technological and industrial prowess, while very impressive, we're not taking away from that, it tells only part of the story. Britain, under total wartime mobilization and subjected to daily bombing, produced tanks, aircraft, and warships in remarkable numbers. They innovated in radar, and they sustained a global navy. The Allied victory was not the work of one nation. It was the product of global cooperation, shared sacrifice, and overlapping strengths. The myth of America as this singular military force not only distorts history, but also disrespects the immense contributions of Britain and the broader Allies. And finally, the dominant American narrative frames World War II as a stark battle between good and evil, democracy versus fascism, which is very important in today's day and age. While the Axis powers undeniably committed horrific crimes, the Allies were far from morally flawless. The US military, for example, remained racially segregated during the war, and
And I reacted to a video on that. Absolutely freaking disgusting. Shout out to the UK, because they were much more accepting and integrated and accepting of African American US soldiers than the US was, which is absolutely ridiculous. But yeah, that was some BS. The video I reacted to, I think it was about the Bamber Bridge. Absolutely ridiculous.
American troops were often relegated to menial labor and non-combat roles. Japanese Americans were forcibly interned in camps on U.S. soil, a blatant violation of constitutional rights, later admitted to have been driven by racism and hysteria rather than military necessity. Meanwhile, Allied bombing campaigns, including the firebombing of Dresden and Tokyo, killed hundreds of thousands of civilians. As Roosevelt aligned with Joseph Stalin, the idea of a purely virtuous alliance breaks down. Yet, American memory tends to gloss over these contradictions in favor of a cleaner and more palatable story. The war's aftermath also complicates the narrative. Far from ushering in a new era of peace, the end of World War II immediately transitioned into the Cold War, with America asserting dominance through military alliances, covert interventions, and nuclear brinkmanship. Book The Politics of War, historian Gabriel Kolko argues that U.S. wartime policies were driven as much by the desire to shape the post-war world as by opposition to fascism. He says American leaders were never content with a victory over the Axis. They sought to shape the entire future of global power. Now that brings me to the end of this episode. I hope you learned something new about the history of World War II. I'm sure many of you have much more to comment below, so leave it in the comments. Thanks very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.
It definitely sounds like she did her research 100%, and she told you exactly how the war went. Y'all talk to me in the comment section. Let me know what you think of the video. If you enjoyed, don't forget to subscribe. Give a video a thumbs up. Check out the next. I'll see y'all next.